Mom hissed, "You're here to wash dishes," and shoved me in front of everyone. I started walking away. Then, 84-year-old Grandpa Elliot slowly stood up, and my mother's face went white. The hand hit my back before I even pulled out my chair. Not a tap, not a touch. A shove. Flat-palmed, deliberate. The kind that moves your whole body forward whether your feet are ready or not. "You're here to wash dishes," my mother said, low and tight, the smile never leaving her face. "Don't embarrass us." And just like that, I was moving toward the kitchen, head down, jaw locked, feet doing what they'd been trained to do my whole life. Comply, disappear, shrink. Behind me, 12 guests in pressed linen. Tiffany's future in-laws seated at the mahogany table my mother had rented specifically for this brunch. The caterers in their crisp black aprons, the sound of champagne flutes and polite conversation, and my sister Tiffany laughing her practiced, perfect laugh. All of them had seen it. None of them said a word. And then I heard it. A chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Slow, like it had somewhere important to be. I stopped walking. I turned. Grandpa Elliot Monroe was standing, 84 years old, a cane in his right hand, his left arm extended, one finger pointing directly at my mother like a man reading a verdict he'd prepared a long time ago. "Then I'll eat where she is." The room went so quiet I could hear the candles. "My name is Ashley Monroe. I am 26 years old, and until 11 weeks ago, I believed, truly, quietly, in the way you believe things you've never been allowed to question, that I was simply the family disappointment. Not dramatic, not abused, just less than. I dropped out of college at 19, not because I was stupid or lazy, but because the anxiety that had been building since childhood finally reached a point where getting out of bed required more energy than I had. I got a job at a home goods retail store called Harbor and Home, where I became, over 5 years, the most reliable shift supervisor they had. I was good at the work. I was good with people. I paid my own rent on a small apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house, drove a 2017 Honda Civic with one dent in the rear bumper, and told myself that quiet and stable was enough. My mother, Clarissa Monroe, née Bartlett, was not a woman who believed in quiet and stable. She was the kind of woman who treated elegance as a moral position. The right schools, the right friends, the right address. She had married my father, Gerald Monroe, when I was not quite 2 years old, and she had spent the subsequent 24 years building a version of the Monroe family that had a specific shape, and I did not fit it. Tiffany did. Tiffany, who was 29, had graduated from a good school with a degree in communications, worked in marketing at a firm downtown, wore the right size, said the right things. Tiffany was currently engaged to a man named Beckett Hargrove, the son of Randolph Hargrove, who owned 3 car dealerships and a vineyard, and the brunch at my parents' house was the official meeting of both families before the engagement party next month. I had been invited. That should have been my first warning. My mother had never invited me to anything that mattered. I had been a background character in my own family for so long that an invitation felt like a trick. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wore my nicest blouse. I showed up at 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, because that's who I am. I was met at the door by my mother in a cream blazer, who looked at me the way you look at a minor inconvenience you've decided to manage. "You can help the caterers," she said. "Stay in the kitchen unless I call you out." I should have left right then. I didn't. For 40 minutes, I sliced fruit and arranged it on platters I would never eat from, refilled water pitchers, and listened through the kitchen door to the sound of my family performing itself for strangers. I told myself it was fine. I told myself this was temporary, that maybe later she'd call me out, introduce me, let me sit. I told myself a lot of things in that kitchen that I no longer believe. At 11:23 a.m., I pushed through the kitchen door with a platter of smoked salmon and nearly walked directly into my mother, who was moving toward me with the specific momentum of someone who wants to redirect a problem. The hand hit my back. The words came through her teeth. "You're here to wash dishes. Don't embarrass us." And then the chair scraped, and Grandpa Elliot was standing. My grandfather, Elliot Monroe, was the kind of man who didn't say much. But when he did, furniture moved. He had built Monroe Holdings from a regional real estate company into something that had offices in 4 cities. He had done it in a suit he'd had dry cleaned twice a year, whether it needed it or not. He was the most quietly powerful person I had ever known, and he had spent most of my childhood at a comfortable distance, present at holidays, generous with birthday checks, but not close to me in any way that felt like he truly saw me. I found out later that was intentional, on my mother's part, but in that dining room, on that Saturday morning, he was standing with his cane and his pointed finger, and he was saying, "I'll eat where she is." My mother laughed, the practiced, dismissive kind. "Dad, she's being dramatic." I said enough, Clarissa. He said her name the way you say a word you're done using. Then he looked at me. "Ashley, sweetheart, lead the way." We sat at the kitchen counter on mismatched stools while Tiffany's future in-laws absorbed what had just happened in the dining room. Grandpa pushed aside the salmon tartare a caterer had set in front of him and asked me where the eggs were. I made him eggs and toast. He ate slowly, deliberately, and for a while we didn't talk. Then he set his fork down. "Why didn't you say anything out there?" I shrugged. "What's the point? They've never listened." He studied my face for a long moment, the way you study something you're trying to memorize. "That's partly my fault," he said. "I let your mother's ego run too long." "Grandpa, this brunch was a test," he said quietly. I stopped. "What?" He picked up his coffee cup, looked into it. "I've been watching your mother for years, the way she treats you. I needed to see it myself, plainly, in front of people she cared about impressing." He set the cup down. "She just failed it. it. My brain was working slowly, like I was translating from a language I almost knew. You set this up? I suggested the brunch to your father. I told him to include you. He paused. I needed to know if she'd treat you like family or like staff. The kitchen door swung open hard enough to hit the wall. My mother stood in the frame, shaking. Not from grief, from fury at being publicly embarrassed by the only person in the world she had never been able to manage. You're humiliating us, she hissed. You did that yourself, he said. She's a dropout who works retail. She doesn't belong at that table. Grandpa didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't adjust his posture by a single degree. She's the only person at that table who's ever done an honest day's work. A pause. And I would rather give her everything I have than watch you use my name to impress wedding guests one more time. My heart stopped working correctly. The trust, the shares, the lake house. He looked at her steadily. All of it. My mother's face went a color I had never seen on it. Not anger. Anger I knew. This was something older and colder. Fear. You wouldn't. I already did, he said. I just needed to see your true colors one last time. Consider today your final audition. She made a sound, not a word, not quite, and then she was gone, the kitchen door swinging behind her. I sat on my stool. My hands were flat on the counter, and I was pressing them down because if I didn't press them down, they were going to shake. Grandpa, my voice came out smaller than I intended. Why me? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he sounded tired. Not the tired of age, the tired of having carried something heavy for a very long time. Because you endured everything they threw at you and stayed kind. You never chased the money. You never begged for love. He looked at his hands. You just survived, and now it's your turn. I was trying to find words when his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted. Speak of the devil, he said, and answered on speaker. My mother's voice blared into the kitchen like she was already mid-sentence. Like the sentence had been building for 20 years. You humiliated me in front of Tiffany's future family. Do you know what that costs us? Do you have any idea? The only thing it cost you was your entitlement, he said. That girl doesn't even belong here. She never did. She isn't even... He hung up. The kitchen was very quiet. I looked at him. What did she mean? He rubbed his temple with 2 fingers, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has been dreading a specific moment for a long, long time, and has finally arrived at it. Tell me, I said. What he told me over the next 20 minutes reorganized every memory I had ever made. Clarissa Monroe was not my biological mother. She had married my father when I was 22 months old. My real mother, my biological mother, was Grace Monroe, Elliot's daughter, my grandfather's child. Grace had died at 31 from an aggressive ovarian cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for. She had been warm and funny, Grandpa said, voice careful and measured, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and meant it. She had loved my father and she had loved me, and she had been gone before I was old enough to hold the memory. My father had met Clarissa 14 months after Grace died. She had been charming in the way that certain people are charming when they want something. Specific, targeted, relentless. She had married him inside the year. She had never wanted me, Grandpa said, quietly and without softening it. She had kept me because losing me would have cost her the marriage, the name, the position. She had spent 24 years treating me as a liability she couldn't get rid of, and she had framed it, always, as discipline, as standards, as simply being particular. It hadn't been discipline. It had been resentment. I should have intervened sooner, Grandpa said. That is something I will have to live with. I was looking at the counter. My vision wasn't blurring, but it wanted to. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a thick envelope on the counter between us. Cream-colored, legal-sized, my name written on the front in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Grace had a younger sister, he said. Your biological aunt. Her name is Ruth. She's been trying to reach you since you were a child. The words landed one at a time. Clarissa intercepted every letter, he said. Every card. Every attempt Ruth made to be part of your life. I looked up at him. Where is she now? He stood slowly, steadied himself on his cane, and walked to the back door of the kitchen. He turned the handle. He opened it. A woman stood on the other side, about 60 years old, auburn hair going silver at the temples, gentle eyes that were, in a way that stopped my breath completely, shaped exactly like mine. She lifted one hand in a small, nervous wave, like she'd been practicing it for a while and wasn't sure she was doing it right. And then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. We need to talk before Grandpa signs anything. There's something about that Will he doesn't know yet. Someone who's been watching this family longer than you think. I stared at that text for 3 seconds, then turned the phone face down. Ruth was still standing in the doorway. We looked at each other. She had the kind of face that had been through something and came out the other side still open to the world, which is the hardest thing to maintain, and the most recognizable quality in the world once you know what to look for. Her eyes were filling. She wasn't trying to stop it. I slid off the stool and walked to the door, and she made a sound, barely a sound really, more like a breath released after being held for 20 years. And then her arms were around me, and I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child and hadn't had the words for why. We stayed like that for a while. Grandpa sat back down on his stool and ate the rest of his eggs. Eventually, I had to look at the text. Ruth and I sat at the counter with Grandpa. I showed them both. Ruth's face did something complicated. Grandpa was quiet for a moment. Then, someone's been watching this family. Who would say that? I asked. Ruth and Grandpa exchanged a look. Your mother, Ruth said carefully, has been managing a lot of things for a long time. The letters were just the beginning. What else? I said. Another look between them. There are documents, Ruth said. said. Things Clarissa signed. Things she filed. Regarding your father's estate planning and Elliot's trust structure, she paused. I've been working with an attorney, quietly, for about 18 months. I looked at my grandfather. Did you know this? Not all of it, he said. Ruth opened her bag and took out a manila folder. After Grace died, your father set up a secondary trust that was meant to pass directly to you on your 25th birthday. It never triggered. She laid the folder on the counter because someone filed a petition to have the trust amended, citing a court-certified document that listed Clarissa as your legal guardian and asserted that you had been formally adopted. My stomach dropped. I was never adopted, I said. No, Ruth said. You weren't. The attorney's name was Margaret Cho, 46 years old, 14 years in estate and probate law, a woman who wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who has seen too much fraud to be surprised by any new variety of it. Ruth had retained her 16 months earlier. She had, over the course of those months, assembled what Margaret Cho described when I sat in her office 6 days after the brunch on a gray Thursday morning, with Ruth beside me and Grandpa's signed authorization in a folder on the desk between us, as a fairly comprehensive picture of sustained financial and legal interference. The adoption document is a forgery, Margaret said, placing a side-by-side comparison in front of me. 2 documents. Mine, and the court filing Clarissa had apparently submitted 11 years ago. The notary seal on the filed document had been verified. It was real. But the notary, a woman named Patricia Duval, had died in 2018 and could not be questioned. We've sent it to a forensic document examiner. His preliminary finding is that the signature on the original consent document does not match your father's signature samples from the same period. I looked at the documents without blinking for what felt like a long time. She forged my father's signature, I said. Preliminarily, yes, that's what the evidence suggests. On a fake adoption. On a petition to the probate court to modify the trust distribution terms. Margaret folded her hands on the desk, which, if it had been filed legitimately, would have been denied, because you were already 14 at the time and would have needed to consent. But it wasn't filed legitimately. What does this mean for the trust? I said. It means the amendment is invalid, which means the original trust structure, your father's intent, should be restored. She paused. The trust was worth approximately $340,000 at the time of your 25th birthday. With accrued interest and investment growth, we're currently looking at closer to $480,000. The number didn't feel real. None of it felt real. And the person who sent the text? I asked. Margaret and Ruth exchanged a glance. We believe it was Patricia Duval's daughter, Ruth said. She found records in her mother's files after she passed. She wasn't sure what to do with them. She reached out to us first, then apparently couldn't wait. I want to be honest about the next 3 weeks, because there's a version of this story where it's clean and quick and satisfying, where the bad person gets exposed and the good people win, and everything resolves in a way that makes sense. Real life is messier than that. My father, Gerald Monroe, sat in Margaret Cho's office on a Tuesday and learned 3 things in sequence. That his wife of 24 years had forged his signature on a legal document, that she had done it to intercept an inheritance meant for his daughter, and that the same daughter had spent those 24 years being treated by the woman he'd chosen to raise her as a burden and a problem. He sat very still for all of it. When Margaret finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I need to call my own attorney. He didn't look at me when he said it. I had spent most of my life wanting my father to look at me, wanting him to see what was happening in his own house. I had told myself he didn't know, couldn't know, that Clarissa was too careful for him to have noticed. Sitting across from him in that office, watching him look at the table instead of his daughter, I understood something I hadn't wanted to. He had known something. Not everything, but something, and he had chosen not to look. The grief of that understanding was different from anything Clarissa had ever made me feel. Clarissa's cruelty had always felt external, a thing being done to me. This was internal. This was the specific grief of realizing that the person who should have been your shield had been making himself comfortable behind it instead. I cried in Ruth's car in the parking garage. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She just sat with me. Your mother, Grace, she would have fought for you, Ruth said eventually. Every single day. I believe that. I have to. The forensic document examiner's formal report came back on a Wednesday. His name was Dr. Thomas Birch, 30 years in questioned document examination, certified by the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners. His conclusion, in technical language, I will simplify here. The signature on the consent document did not match Gerald Monroe's authenticated signatures. The probability of the signature being genuine was, in his professional opinion, less than 2%. Margaret Cho filed a complaint with the probate court on a Thursday. The following Monday, a detective from the County Financial Crimes Unit, Detective Raymond Ashford, 12 years on the force, 6 of them in fraud, called me at 9:14 a.m. and asked if I was available to give a formal statement. Yes, I said. Absolutely yes. I gave the statement in an interview room with pale green walls and a table that wobbled slightly. Detective Ashford was methodical, thorough, and said very little about what he thought of the case. He asked questions. He listened. He took notes. On the way out, he said, keep your phone on. Clarissa was served with notice of the probate court filing on a Thursday evening. I know this because Tiffany called me at 9:47 p.m., which was the first time my sister had called me in 4 months. What did you do? She said. Her voice was the voice of someone whose world has just shifted under her feet and who has decided, based on 29 years of practice, to blame the most convenient person available available. I didn't do anything, I said. I just stopped letting things be done to me. Silence. Tiffany. I kept my voice even. Did you know about the trust? A pause that told me everything. Mom mentioned there was some legal thing when I was in college, she said. I didn't know what it was. I didn't ask. She didn't ask. She hadn't wanted to know, the same way my father hadn't wanted to look. There's a category of harm that gets committed not through cruelty, but through comfort, through the deliberate choice not to see what seeing might cost you. I don't know what to call it exactly. Complicity feels too strong and innocence feels too gentle. What I know is that it is its own kind of abandonment, and it leaves its own kind of mark. I hope the wedding is beautiful, I said. And I meant it, genuinely, because I am not interested in punishing people for who they chose to be. But I can't pretend none of this happened. She hung up. I put my phone face down and went to bed. The probate court hearing was in February. Clarissa arrived with her own attorney, a man named Howard Sellis, who wore an expensive watch and had the manner of someone paid to look unimpressed. She was dressed in cream, always polished, always performing for whoever was watching. She did not look at me. I sat at the petitioner's table with Margaret Cho on my left and Ruth on my right, and I kept my hands flat on the table and my breathing even and my face composed, which was difficult but not as difficult as I had expected, because by February I had been seeing a therapist for 6 weeks. Her name was Dr. Simone Adeyemi, a licensed clinical psychologist who specialized in family trauma and estrangement. She had told me, in our 4th session, something I had written on a piece of paper and put in my wallet. You are not reacting to what's happening now. You are healing from what happened then. The two things can look the same from the outside, but they feel completely different on the inside. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The forensic evidence was presented, Dr. Birch's report, the probate court's own analysis of the original filing, the notary records showing that Patricia Duval's seal had been used, and the timeline showing the filing had occurred 17 months after Duval had retired from active practice. Howard Sellis objected to several things. The judge, the Honorable Diana Yee, 22 years on the bench, overruled him each time with the brisk efficiency of someone who has seen document fraud before and does not find it interesting. At 3:47 p.m., Judge Yee ruled that the 2013 trust amendment was invalid, entered on the basis of a fraudulent petition, and ordered the trust restored to its original terms. She also referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. She said this last part the way you say something that is simply the next logical step, without drama, without pause, just the clean machinery of consequence. Clarissa was charged with forgery, fraud upon the court, and theft by deception in April. I won't pretend that felt the way I thought it would feel. I had expected something cathartic, some closing click of the universe restoring its balance. What I actually felt, sitting in Ruth's kitchen when she told me the charges had been filed, was tired, not bitter. Just the quiet, specific tiredness of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. My father filed for divorce in March. I don't know the details, and I haven't asked. His attorney contacted Margaret Cho to confirm he would not contest the probate ruling. That's the extent of our current communication. I don't know how to have a relationship with my father yet. I'm not sure I'm ready to decide. Dr. Adeyemi says I don't have to be ready on anyone else's timeline. I'm practicing believing that. The lake house sits on a property in northern Georgia that my grandfather bought in 1987 and had been using intermittently since. In March, Grandpa Elliott formalized the transfer of title, along with his shares in Monroe Holdings and the provisions of the trust, through a process that took 3 weeks, 1 afternoon of paperwork, and a notary public whose credentials I personally verified. I drove out to see the lake house for the first time on a Sunday in late March. It was smaller than I had imagined. A good small, a sensible small, the kind of place built for actual living rather than impressing anyone. Wood-paneled walls, a porch that looked out over still water, a kitchen with good light. Someone had left a coffee maker on the counter. I stood in the kitchen for a while, just looking at the light. Ruth came out the following weekend with groceries and a set of curtains she'd picked out. We cooked dinner together. I didn't know she was a good cook, and she didn't know I was terrible at it, so we spent an hour figuring it out together, which was the most normal thing I had done in what felt like years. After dinner, sitting on the porch, she told me about Grace. Not the tragedy of her, the life of her, the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable details of a person who had existed. Her handwriting, which was terrible, the way she had always ordered too much food and been embarrassed about it, the summer she had learned to sail and capsized 4 times in a single afternoon and laughed until she cried. I listened to every word. I think I will be listening for a long time. Grandpa Elliott died in June, peacefully, in his own bed. Ruth was there. I was there. He had declined faster than any of us expected in the months after the brunch, in the way that sometimes happens with elderly people, once they have resolved whatever it was they were holding on to finish. At the end, he held my hand. You never needed any of this to be enough, he said. He meant the money, the property, all of it. I just wanted you to have it anyway. I know, I said. Thank you. He closed his eyes. He didn't open them again. It is September now. I still work at Harbor and Home, 3 days a week, in a consulting capacity, helping them overhaul their inventory management systems in a way I had been suggesting for 2 years, and they are finally implementing. It turns out that 5 years of quiet, careful, unglamorous work had given me an operational knowledge that, when properly applied, was worth something to the right people. My apartment is the same one I had before. I haven't moved moved into the lake house yet. I'm not ready. But I've been going on weekends, and each time I stay a little longer. I had lunch with Tiffany last month. She is still getting married. Beckett seems, from what I can tell, like a genuinely decent person, which I'm glad of. We sat in a restaurant and talked about Grace, which neither of us had ever done before, and Tiffany cried and I let her. Because whatever she chose not to see, she is still my sister. I see Dr. Adeyemi every Thursday. We are working through something she calls the archaeology of self-worth, the slow, methodical work of digging through everything you were told about who you were and finding out what was actually true underneath. It is the hardest work I have ever done. It is also the only work that has ever made me feel like I am building something that will hold. Ruth texts me, "Good morning," every day. Sometimes just a word, morning. Sometimes a photograph of something she's made for breakfast. Sometimes a sentence about something she remembered about Grace. I keep every one of them. There is a text I think about sometimes. Someone who's been watching this family longer than you think. Patricia Duval's daughter sent that message because she had found, in a box of her mother's retirement files, evidence of something she didn't know how to name, and the only thing she could think to do was warn someone. She did it anonymously. She did it imperfectly. She did it anyway. I found her through Ruth's attorney and wrote her a letter, thanking her, telling her that what she did mattered, that sometimes doing the right thing looks less like a dramatic gesture and more like sending a text to a stranger and hoping it lands somewhere useful. She wrote back, "I'm glad it helped. Your mom, Grace, my mother always said she was the kindest client she ever had." I read that once and then again, and then I folded the letter and put it in the envelope with the other things I am keeping now, the things that prove she was real and good and mine. My grandfather's cane is in the corner of my living room. I didn't ask for it specifically. It was just there, in the house, after everything. A plain wooden cane with a rubber tip, the kind that belonged to a man who used it because he needed it, and not for any other reason. I look at it sometimes, and I think about a chair scraping across a hardwood floor, slow, deliberate, and an 84-year-old man standing up in a room full of people who had spent decades staying seated. He said her name like a verdict. He looked at me like I was already worth everything. And I know, that moment was the first time in my life I understood what it feels like to be chosen. Not for what you've achieved or what you're worth or what you can give someone, just chosen for surviving, for staying kind, for being exactly who you are in a family that spent years telling you that wasn't enough. I'm still learning how to live inside that feeling, but I'll tell you this much, it fits.